Good evening, everybody. Is that too loud? No, good. All right, great. So welcome to the Community Church of Chapel Hill Unitarian Universalist, and welcome to this lecture, Article 2, Our Evolving Purposes, Principles, Sources, Values, and Covenants. And with a group like this, I wouldn't normally do this formally. I would come down and sit and we would all discuss, but I've been requested to sort of record this. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to give this like a more, a formal presentation, or not that formal, but a more formal presentation or lecture, and so that it's recorded so that anybody who's watching online or who wants to access it in the future can watch that. And then what we're going to do is I will hit stop, and then we will kind of have a circle up and have a discussion. I don't think that a discussion with microphones and live cast would work well as a recording. So welcome to those who are watching on live stream, and welcome to those who are viewing this as a recording. What this is about is that at this year's General Assembly, there is a proposal to adopt a rewrite of Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. What is Article 2, you may ask? I will get into that in a few minutes. And that the Article 2, though, I will tell you, contains what we know right now as the 7 principles and the 6 sources, and so which many people take to be as a central expression of Unitarian Universalism. And so with that rewrite or revision of it, that might be interesting to some people. I want to say that I offered this talk as a 4-session class, which is actually the format that I preferred. I offered it as a 4-session class in January, and 12 people attended. And then I offered it as a 4-session class in February, and 21 people attended on 4 consecutive Thursday nights. After this, in April, Sanctuary for Dialogue is going to be offering 2 sessions. On April 15th, they're going to be offering, Saturday afternoon, April 15th, they're going to be offering an in-person dialogue for people to talk. And on Thursday, April 27th, Sanctuary for Dialogue is going to be offering a Zoom dialogue about this. And then coming up in June, from June 21st to 25th, the Unitarian Universalist Association will be holding its General Assembly in Pittsburgh in person and online all over the world. And you'll be hearing more later tonight about how you could possibly be involved in that. Before I get into this, I want to share my commitments. These are the same commitments that I made when I taught this as a class. My commitments are to share with you all the information that I have openly and honestly. My second commitment is to share all the information that I have in an unbiased way. And since it really isn't possible to be unbiased, to at least admit when I am being biased. My third commitment is to strive to create an atmosphere during my classes, during this talk, and within our church, where people can express their feelings about this material honestly, and where we can all learn, discuss, and share openly. It's not my goal to get you to reach a specific conclusion or a specific point on this subject. And finally, I will admit that in my heart of hearts, I believe that I am responsible for my relationship with the congregation, and I'm responsible for my own relationship with the UUA, but I am not responsible for the congregation's relationship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. That's your business. So that's a bias of mine. I gave you a number of handouts when you came in, and these handouts are going to be all, if they're not already, they're all online under the Sanctuary for Dialogue page on the church website. But I'll tell you about the three handouts. The first handout, number 1, it's 1 page, 2 sides, and that is a lecture outline. I always sort of give, when I teach a class, I always give an outline so you can see how much left there is. If you're needing to go watch a baseball game or something like that, you can tell how much is left. The second page, which is about 8 pages double-sided, and that contains 3 versions of Article 2, the 1961 one, the 1985 one, and the proposed one to be adopted in 2024. And then the last one, which is a stapled 2 pages front and back, you can just set that one off to the side. That's my final remarks, and I'll come to that later. So don't read ahead. So Article 2. What is Article 2, and why do we have it? Article 2 is a section of the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws, which are the legal documents that govern the Unitarian Universalist Association as an incorporated nonprofit in the state of Massachusetts. And under Massachusetts state law, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that organizations are required to have in their bylaws a statement of their purpose. A nonprofit is required to articulate its purpose. And so Article 1 of the UUA bylaws is the name of our organization is the Unitarian Universalist Association, and Article 2, I believe under state law, they're required to say what their purpose is. But historically, it serves a more important purpose than that. In 1961, when this was first written, it was the time of merger, when the Unitarian Association, the American Unitarian Association, and the Universalist Church of America were merging, and these 2 entities were creating something new, and there was a lot of compromise and worry and anxiety about what this new faith would be that they were going to be creating through merger. And so in Article 2, they attempted to express what are the purposes, principles, reasons for being that would govern this new merged denomination. Article 2 of 1961 was highly conflicted. There were reportedly debates that went late into the night and disagreements that threatened to sink the entire merger. And so if you read this, Article 2, which I've given you, of 1961, it is the result of a lot of compromise and unhappiness. And debate in 1961 was largely focused about how to name and whether to name and how much to name the specific Christian origins of Unitarianism and Universalism, or to name it more generally as a universal religious tradition. In the class, what I would do is we'd read it aloud, and then we would go and I'd ask questions, and we'd break into groups, and people would talk about it and react to it and things like that. But I want to share some observations about Article 2 in 1961. First, they call it the 6 principles, but they are not really principles. In their language, number 5, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. That's not a principle. That's a goal or a purpose. If you read the 6, it is striking how masculine they are. There's the language love of man, dignity of man, ideals of brotherhood, men of goodwill in every land. And when I taught this as a class, people thought, oh, this sounds really dated. It's interesting as you read the 6 principles of 1961 that you can see earlier versions of some of the 7 principles that we know and that are familiar to us. There is the disciplined search for truth, which is like our 4th principle. There is the supreme worth of every human personality, which we know as the inherent worth and dignity of every person. There's the use of the democratic method, which is like our 5th principle. And there is the world community with justice and peace, which sounds an awful lot like our 6th. And so you can see that definitely the 7 principles that we have today emerged from this. There is, though, as people noted, no seventh principle. There is no kind of idea of an interdependent web that's existing in 1961. And I also want to note one more thing about the 1961, which is that Section 3, and on the back I actually gave you a photocopy from, I think it's from microfiche or something like that, of what that actually looked like in 1961. There's this profound statement in Section 3, profound statement of congregational polity, and part of it deals with the freedom for ministers, that no minister shall be given a creedal test. And this is actually dropped from all future versions, which is interesting. So you've got the Article 2 of 1961. Question, how was this used? How did Unitarian Universalists in the 60s and 70s and early 80s make use of this? And the answer is they didn't. It wasn't used. It was not printed on wallet cards or bookmarks. It was not worn on clothing. It was not put on posters and hung in rooms in the church. It was not included in the hymnal. I actually have here the first Unitarian Universalist hymnal of 1963, and there is no mention of these principles in there. It was not memorized. It was not taught in religious education. It was not mentioned in sermons, as our sixth principle says. And it was not at all a part of Unitarian Universalist identity. All right. I actually ended the first class on the principles. We talked about this and we discussed it and people shared their ideas and impressions. And then before I sent them away, I gave them two thoughts to send with them. The first is the idea that Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. There has been a sense for as long as we've been a faith that we are a living and evolving religious tradition. You can go back all the way 403 years ago. In July 1620, Pastor John Robinson gave a sermon in Leiden, Netherlands, to the Congregationalists who were about to leave to the Netherlands for England to get the boat in order to go over to the New World on the Mayflower. And he said in that sermon as he sent them away, "For I am very confident the Lord hath more truth and more light yet to break forth from his holy word." Or as one of our hymns put it, "Lo, that word abideth ever, revelation is not sealed, answering now to our endeavor, truth and right are still revealed." That we're a faith tradition that involves continuous revelation and change. There is yet more light to break forth from the divine's holy word. And then I sent people away after that first night with this one thing, that if you actually go to a different bylaw, UUA bylaw C15.1.c section 6, if you want to look it up, it says this: if no study process of Article 2 has occurred for a period of 15 years, the Board of Trustees shall appoint a commission to study Article 2 for not more than 2 years and to recommend appropriate revisions, if any, thereto to the Board of Trustees for inclusion on the agenda of the next regular General Assembly. So it's actually written in our bylaws that every 15 years you're supposed to look at Article 2 and appoint a commission and decide how to change it. The second of the two classes dealt with the Article 2 as we know it today, or sort of as we know it today, which is Article 2 of 1985. And we'll move through this. This will move quickly. I hope you're not bored yet. So, to understand how Article 2 came into being, you have to go back to 1977. In 1977, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly passed the Women and Religion Resolution. It passed it unanimously. And this resolution, I think many things that, organizations pass, sometimes don't make a difference. This made a difference. And the Women and Religion Resolution asked to basically do an audit of all of Unitarian Universalism for sexism, for sexist language, for sexism in all of its bylaws and policies and practices, and to fully incorporate women at all levels of leadership throughout the denomination. In 1977, there were about a dozen women serving as ministers in Unitarian Universalism. 20 years later, women made up more than half of all UU ministers. And if you go back to this is probably the reason, the reason for these changes. But another thing that the Women and Religion Resolution forced the UUA to do was to look at all of their documents and policies and look for sexism and look at how to include women. And when they went to the UUA bylaws, they got to section 2 and they found brotherhood, fellowship, the good of man, and all of these things. And so there began to be a movement to change it. I'm not going to go through the whole history here. There is a really excellent article on the materials online by Warren Ross. It's about 6 pages, 6 really big pages, and it's a little long, but it's a really excellent article, both about the history of how the Article 2 of 1985 was passed and some of how it's been used since. Needless to say, that originally they did, the first pass at it, they did what was called a manhunt, where they went through and they struck all the sexist language, but nobody was really happy with that rewrite, and so they developed a commission, and the commission rewrote over a period of years. And it's remarkable that when it passed in 1984 and 1985, that it was passed nearly unanimously and everybody was happy with it, that there was widespread acclaim, that people were very satisfied and happy with the principles and the sources. And the principles and sources, unlike the 1961, they were used everywhere. They were printed on wallet cards, and some of you may have wallet cards in your wallet with them, on bookmarks, on posters. They were included in the front of the hymnal, and as a responsive reading, number 594, in the back of the hymnal. They were printed on clothing, t-shirts. I actually bought, when I was a junior in high school, I bought a 7 Principles t-shirt. At either the first or second UUA General Assembly that I went to, the young adult group was selling 7 Principle underwear, where you could get any of the 7 principles printed on boxer shorts or underwear. And you could decide what you think about how that either affirms our religion or makes fun of it. The 7 principles and 6 sources were used in religious education materials, in sermon series. Last church year, I preached a sermon series on the 6 sources. And in music, I think of the Sources Cantata by Jason Shelton and Kendall Gibbons that was performed here many years ago. But the principles and sources were ubiquitous. And even though they have been regarded with a great deal of popularity, there have been some criticisms of them. And I want to name those criticisms, but even though I name them, I want to say that this represents a very, very, very small sliver of Unitarian Universalism. The first criticism was that there was a minister of a large UU church, and I won't say where, who absolutely despised the 7 principles and the sources and banned them from use in his congregation. And he referred to them in the pulpit as the 7 banalities and the 7 dwarfs. And he was later fired by a vote of the congregation, so there's that. Another criticism of them were actually leveled at them by UUA President Bill Sinkford, which is actually funny. People who've been the most critical of the principles through the years have been the UUA president, which is an interesting. I think Unitarian Universalists, we practice criticism as a form of love sometimes. Here's what Bill Sinkford said in a sermon in 2003. Quote, "So I went and reread the principles and purposes. I know, I'm supposed to know them by heart. But I reread them, and I realized that we have in our principles an affirmation of our faith that uses not one single piece of religious language, not even one word that would be considered traditionally religious. And that's a wonderment to me. I wonder whether this kind of language can adequately capture who we are and what we're about. The principles and purposes frame a broad ethic, but not a theology. They contain no hint of the holy." And I don't necessarily agree with Reverend Sinkford, but I think it's pretty remarkable that, the president of the association, and this happens, the president of the association in 1979 did the same thing, and more recently. And then a third criticism of them was actually leveled by my childhood minister. So when I was 16, 17, I was absolutely on fire about Unitarian Universalism. I had my Seven Principles t-shirt that I had ordered from the UUA bookstore. And I told him in just this, just very, very earnestly, I said to him, I memorized the Seven Principles. And he said, "Why would you do that? I don't even know what they are or what they have to do with Unitarian Universalism." Now, I will say that my minister was not a jerk. That sounds like a jerky thing to say, and I was actually kind of a little heartbroken then. He was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful minister, a great colleague, and his response wasn't to sort of try to break my heart. I think he literally did not ever have a sense about how something in the UUA bylaws was related to the practice of religious life and ministry. That was kind of beyond his imagination in 1994. Since 1985, when the principles and purposes were adopted, there have been numerous changes, numerous attempts to change them. And I want to take you through these. In 1995, so 10 years after they were passed, there was a vote to add a sixth source, the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred cycle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. I want to invite people to open up your hymnals, if you have a hymnal with you, to hymn number 1. And then what I'm going to have you do is turn back one page, turn leaf back one page, and you'll find in your hymnal the 7 principles at the top and the sources at the bottom. And if you go down to the bottom of the sources, which is the indented section, how many people's end with humanist teachings as the last one? Here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And how many's end with sacred teachings of earth-centered? 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason why is that in 1993, 94, when we bought our hymnals, we didn't have a 6th source. And then when we added it, they printed the hymnals with the new 6th source. So that got added, and we have different hymnals. We have about half of our hymnals that we bought in 93, 94, and they're the old version, and half with the new language. So that was the first change. And by the way, you may be interested to know that vote was actually fairly close, that there was a great deal of debate about whether adding a 6th source would be something that was good or not. There was considerable debate about it. In 2006 to 2008, the UUA board put together another Article 2 study commission to propose revisions, and in 2008 they brought those revisions to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly voted them down. It seems like very few people remember that process, or that process even occurred, but there was an attempt to revise them then that failed. In 2017, there was a vote to remove the gender binary from the principles and purposes, and so there was that the teachings of prophetic women and men became the teachings of prophetic people. In 2017, there was a motion that was about to be brought to the General Assembly to change the first principle, to replace the inherent worth and dignity of every person and change it to the inherent worth and dignity of every being. And this organization that had worked, I think it was called the First Principle Project, had worked and collected and organized to bring this. And then at the 2017 General Assembly, they actually removed this. They removed this change from the business meeting. And I'll say, and it's interesting. You can think about that. How would that be different if we said inherent worth and dignity of every being versus every person? But the reason that it was removed was that in 2017, there was a huge amount of conflict happening within Unitarian Universalism over the lack of hiring of people of color in high-ranking positions all across the denomination. And there was a huge amount of conflict about whether people of color felt welcomed and affirmed, fully welcomed in our movement. And the group that had put together the First Principle Project said, we do not want to have a UUA debate about whether dogs and cats have inherent worth and dignity if we're also hearing that people are feeling from our movement that they're not having their full worth and dignity affirmed. And so the First Principle Project pulled their recommended change. And then another change happened. So you've got 1995, 2006, twice in 2017, there was 2 changes. And then in 2018, there was the 8th principle, in 2018 to present. And the 8th principle was this movement to add an 8th principle to the 7. And the 8th principle was journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And what was different about this is this was not actually put forward as something for the UUA to vote on. It was actually a grassroots movement, and instead of going through the General Assembly process to change Article 2, proponents of the 8th principle went directly to congregations, urging them to pass an 8th principle at the congregational level. And so you can tell that from 2017 and 2018, their changes are afoot, and that brings us to the present day. In 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association Board appointed an Article 2 study commission. This is by our bylaws that it's to happen every 15 years. The previous time it happened was 2006, so it was time. And they worked through the pandemic, and their work was delayed some by the pandemic. And in January of this year, they released a 26-page report to Unitarian Universalism. I have a link to the full report that's on the church website, and I encourage people to, even though it's 26 pages, I encourage you to read it. There's actually a number of pictures, so it reads fairly quick. The proposed changes to Article 2 are found on pages 19 to 23, and I actually have them copied. They're the last 2 pages of the large handout I gave you. What's interesting, I want to pull out a couple of things from the Article 2 Study Commission report that I find interesting. On page 1, the commissioners write, and this is not I gave you can look this up, On page 1, the commissioners write, "It's time for us to do a review and make changes so that we're living into the Unitarian Universalism of the future, a Unitarian Universalism that holds us in times of great need and ethical, moral, and spiritual crises. We are in one of those times now." And so that there is this idea that we are in a special time, a time when things are in crisis, moral, ethical, and spiritual crises and great need. On page 13 and 14, they say something that I think that they mean entirely seriously, but just reading it is almost there's a little humor in there. They say of Article 2 that the main functions of Article 2 in our bylaws are legal and organizational. It defines who we are in a legal sense. However, it became clear to us that in addition to these main functions, there were many other functions that UUs expected Article 2 to fulfill. And these include theological, helping us to articulate our shared values and theology; social functions, serving as a shared cultural touchstone; educational functions, listing concepts to teach and sources to draw from; personal functions, serving as a personal code of ethics; evangelical functions, functioning as a way to explain to others who we are and to draw their interest; and rhetorical functions, to be used in public situations to define our beliefs or morality in legal or political contexts. We expect an awful lot of Article 2. I just want to note that. So, in the Article 2 rewrite, and I'm going to assume that you've read it. If not, you can read it. What they do is they replace the principles and the sources and the other things they replace the principles with a section describing our values and our covenant. And they say that love, or liberating love, is the foundation of our faith, from which we derive 6 values: interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. And then for each of these values, there is a covenant of how we promise to promote that value, in our religious living. One of the things that the commissioners note is that current principles and purposes have very few verbs, that the only verbs are to affirm and promote, which aren't very active verbs, but these have all sorts of active verbs. When I taught this during the daytime group, there was a lot of questions and comments about this idea of love, or liberating love, being at the center of our faith. And there was a lot of questions about what that was about. So I actually developed, I didn't give this out to you, but I developed a subsequent handout that I called "What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding?" and went through various parts, both of world religions and our faith, listing articulations of love. Started with 1 John, God is love. Going to Matthew, Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and all the prophets." We say in church with our children, we teach them to say we're the church of the open mind, the loving hearts, and the helping hands. Many churches begin their services by reciting in unison, "Love is the doctrine of this church." We sing, "We are answering the call of love," or "Standing on the side of love." And of course, the Beatles sang, "All you need is love." And so I offered those sort of reflections to kind of think about what it would mean give people some thoughts about what it would mean to think of love or liberating love as at the center of our faith. I also found and gave out to groups a quote by, I actually looked up Christian Universalist love, or actually I looked up Universalist love into Google, and one of the first highest hits I got was from a evangelical conservative Christian group who had published a refutation of universalism. And according to the Ethos Institute for Public Christianity, and they mean this as a negative, Christian Universalists tend to emphasize God's love, forgiveness, and mercy, while downplaying the holiness, righteousness, and wrath of the same God. Yes, we do. Praise be. So when I taught this in the 4 sessions, we had 2 sessions where we broke up into groups and talked about them and sort of read the Article 2 and reflected upon it. And so I want to actually sort of conclude, and we're doing 4 classes in about 40 minutes here. So I want to conclude by just saying a little bit about what's next. What's next at the UUA level and what's next at our church level. And then I want to offer a couple of closing thoughts and give you a gift, which I've actually already given you, so it's not really a surprise. So the UUA process for changing Article 2 is that they appoint a study commission. The study commission gives a report to the Unitarian Universalist Association Board. That was done in January. And then it is brought up at the next General Assembly. And so what will happen is when Unitarian Universalists gather in Pittsburgh and online all over the world in late June, that there will be a series of mini assemblies where people will get to propose all sorts of different edits and amendments and word changes and additions and subtractions, and those will all be voted up or down and incorporated, and then at the General Assembly there will be a vote on whether to adopt Article 2. It requires a 50% vote, and if it passes, then it goes into a second year of study, and it's taken up at the next year's General Assembly, 2024, in June in Portland, Oregon, and online, where it will require a 2/3 vote to be adopted, and then it's incorporated as the new Article 2. If it fails either of those votes, then there's actually a 2-year timeout period where no changes to Article 2 can be considered for 2 years. And so what we will be voting on in General Assembly in Pittsburgh is whether to advance it to a second year of study or not. What's happening in terms of the process at our church is that I led a class in January, I led a class in February, I'm giving this lecture in March. In April, Sanctuary for Dialogue will be holding a pair of dialogues on Article 2 for people to come and talk and share their feelings. And this spring, the Governance Committee of the Board of Trustees, which is led by Mary Beth, and as well as Barb Chapman is a member of that committee. Mary Beth Powell and Barb Chapman will be leading that. They will be meeting to determine a process that the board will vote on for selecting delegates to the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. Our congregation has no rules or processes in place for how delegates are selected. We are allowed, because we are a congregation between 400 and 450 members. When we reported our membership in February, we're allowed to have 9 delegates to General Assembly. In all the years that I've been a minister here, we have never sent our full complement of delegates. And by the way, I should say that we have 9 And then I am actually an automatic delegate because I am a settled minister of the congregation. And Marion now is an automatic delegate because she is a credentialed religious educator who is employed here. So neither Marion nor I count against that delegate. We're like super delegates, and you can choose whether you can think whether that's democratic or not, and that's a different subject, that's a different discussion. But how will those 9 delegates, so in 2000, most years we've sent 0, 1, 2, 1 of our 8, 9 delegates to General Assembly. This year, the one exception to that was in 2017 when the General Assembly was in New Orleans and we brought a huge contingent down there. And what we did was we had a meeting of all the people who were going, and we sat them down in a room together and we said, being a delegate means that you have to go to all of the plenary sessions, all of the meetings, all of the mini assemblies. You actually have to go every time there's a vote and vote. Who wants to be a delegate? And people actually self-sorted that way. That the people who are more interested in, exploring New Orleans opted not to, and so it was a self-sorting. But the governance committee will be creating a process if we have more than 9 people who want to go to determine how to select those 9. Right, Mary Beth? Right. Okay. Good. You weren't told this when you said that you'd be on the board. And yeah, there have been years, but not since I've been here. And then I will say though that what we'll probably do a call out in the next kind of month or so, asking who wants to go, and to help figure out how we pick and what the fair way to pick would be. So that is that's the process. I'm just going to end with a few closing thoughts that I have. I want to share one closing thought is that there have always been attempts to articulate our shared purposes, principles, sources, values, and covenants. And Article 2, I believe, doesn't stop that conversation. It doesn't stop it if it fails, and it doesn't stop it if it passes. That's an ongoing thing that our faith will continue to do. And then I want to leave you with a gift that I left with the classes that I taught as well, which is the last handout here, which is the one with 2 pages on it, and it begins 5 points of a new theology. And what this is that it would be possible if it weren't, if I were to teach a completely different class, it would be possible to teach a class on articulations of our purposes, values, and identity without any mention of Article 2. I would start with William Channing Gannett's Things Most Commonly Believed Today Among Us from 1887, where he attempts actually start with 1886 and James Freeman Clarke's Points of a New Theology. And it's written basically a year later, 1887, as sort of a response, as a pushback. William Channing Gannett's Things Most Commonly Believed Today Among Us. I'd go further than that to 1936, where there was a report from the UUA's Commission on Appraisal called Unitarians Face a New Age, in which they released a report that was called Unitarians Agree, Unitarians Disagree. And they named 6 things that they think all UUs agree on, all Unitarians agree on, and 5 things that they don't agree on. And then I would put up the David Rankin's What Do Unitarian Universalists Believe?, which actually came out, I believe, in the 1980s, at the same time that the Principles did. And it's a list of 10 things that Unitarian Universalists believe in common. And then I'd end by teaching about the UU elevator speeches that this was all the rage in 2003, 2004, And I want to close this evening by just reading two of those that were published in 2003, 2004. There was this challenge about how would you articulate Unitarian Universalism if somebody asked you on the top floor of the elevator, what is Unitarian Universalism? How would you explain it before the elevator reached to the bottom? And here are two of them that I want to read. The first is by Ruth Bragg, a member of the First Parish of Bedford in Bedford, Massachusetts. She said that she would say, believing that reason is a part of faith, action the result of prayer, inquiry part of tradition, knowledge of the past part of the promise of the future, we gather together to gain strength in diversity and to worship the seen, the unseen, and the generosity of spirit we help into being. And we laugh a lot. And then Lila Ibrahim, who was then a young adult from Oakland, California, said that her elevator speech would be, it's a blessing each of us was born. It matters what we do with our lives. What each of us knows about God is a part of the truth. We don't have to do it alone. Thank you all for coming to this session. Four classes in 50 minutes. Thank you.